the endometrium can pose to be a problem in infertility. And so I will touch those aspects of management of thin endometrium, and Sir will touch the very important part of tuberculosis and infertility, which I'm sure most of us are waiting to hear.
Again,
Again, I'll request all delegates to kindly put your speakers on mute, as it may disturb the other viewers. All right, so thin endometrium, where are we today? We'll go through its definition, prevalence, assessment, cause, and treatment. Now, as we all know, measuring the endometrial thickness is one of the most important aspects of infertility management. So there are two important scans that needs to be done in any workup of infertility. One is the day 2 to day 4 ultrasound, and one is the mid-cycle scan. Now, the day 2 to day 4 scan ensures downregulation. It also ensures that there is no follicular cyst, thick endometrium, etc. And the mid-cycle scan tells us about the endometrial thickness. Now, it is the maximal difference between the echogenic interfaces of endometrium and myometrium plane. So it has to be the uppermost border here till the lowermost border here, and it should not go into the myometrium on either side, otherwise it will give a false high level. Ideal should be transvaginal empty bladder. So this measurement of endometrial thickness goes a long way for us to decide what is the overall prognosis and the treatment plan of the patient. So not only do we have to assess the endometrial thickness, we also have to assess the endometrial receptivity. Now, regarding the thickness, what is actually thin? Is it 6 millimeters, is it 7, or is it 8 millimeters? Now, there has been a lot of study, especially in more than 40,000 articles, embryo transfer, in which they have found that in fresh IVF cycles, 8 millimeters may be considered a cutoff, and in frozen embryo cycles, 7 millimeters may be considered to be the cutoff. Now, we must understand that it does not mean that less than 7 or less than 8 in frozen or fresh respectively will not give us pregnancy. In fact, even in patients who had 5 to 6 millimeters of endometrial thickness, there was even up to a 20% pregnancy rate. So it's a real fine demarcation as to what is the thickness, what is the quality of the endometrium, and what are the causes that affect the endometrium for that particular patient, to give us an overall assessment whether this patient is going to get pregnant with this particular endometrium or not. The other thing that we need to understand is that, of course, our most measurements, say in a ovulation induction cycle or in an IUI cycle or in an IVF cycle, is on the day of the HCG. That's when we measure, most studies discuss whether it is thick or thin. But the other thing that many of us, especially those practicing IVF, would have seen, that on the day of HCG, we have seen that the endometrium is very good. However, once the ovulation has occurred, we have retrieved the eggs and the patient has come for the embryo transfer or the IUI in the progesterone phase of the endometrium, we may sometimes see that the endometrium has shrunken. And endometrium compaction is not unheard of in the proliferative phase. However, if the shrunken part of the endometrium is minus 20% of what it was on the day of the HCG, then the pregnancy rate can become almost half. So if you see, if the endometrium has increased after the HCG, the pregnancy rates are close to 50 to 60%. but if it has reduced, the pregnancy rate is about 30%. So it is very important to discuss this with the patient, to tell the patient, and if you wish, you may want to freeze the embryos and transfer in the next cycle if the endometrium on the day of transfer is more than 20% thin of what it was on the day of your HCG. Now, we are doing ovulation stimulation cycles, IVF cycles. The prevalence is sometimes as high as 38 to 40%. Of course, depends on your study population. But in IVF cycle, the prevalence has been indicated quite low, maybe because most of the women who have low endometrium have already been cancelled or removed from the study. So they did not go to embryo transfer and they were excluded. So this may be a false negative value of the prevalence of low endometrial thickness in ART cycles. Now we all know the ultrasound is the tool. It has almost become our stethoscope and everything to assess our patients. And not only do we have to assess the thickness, we also have to assess the pattern, the volume, and Doppler. Now regarding the pattern, we all know that a triple layer, the trilaminar, is the most receptive. The intermediate echogenicity, as that of a myometrium, is the next, and homogeneous hyperechoic, more than the myometrium, is not such a receptive endometrium. So endometrium pattern is a better indicator of the probability of pregnancy than endometrial thickness. Now, why do we say that? Thickness is important and so is the pattern. Now, in a, say for example, we'll come to that study in a bit, but let us also touch upon volume and Doppler. The endometrium volume mid-cycle has to be between 3 to 5 cc. Now, with all the 3D, ultrasound machinery that has come up, it is very easy to give the volume. And however, when there have been studies comparing volume to pregnancy, there has not been very strong correlation. And similarly, Doppler has also given excellent correlation of overall pregnancy in some studies, but could not be, summated in large studies. There have been studies where even poor Doppler, poor subendometrial perfusion was not associated with low pregnancy, or they have done Doppler studies in non-infertile, that means fertile population, and they have seen that it does not all, they do not always have a wonderful subendometrial perfusion. So it's a bit of a debate whether Doppler should be a criteria to tell us whether the endometrium is receptive or not. So you are seeing your patient in OPD. Patient has come with repeated failures, inability to conceive, failure of ovulation induction, IUI. You have done your day 3, day 4 scan, you have done your mid-cycle scan, and you see poor endometrium. And poor antral follicle count still can be treated. Of course, our last option is DonorEC, but what to do with the poor endometrium? So important thing is to first identify or there is any. So this is very, very important. Please identify the cause now, if possible. So the cause could be acute or chronic infection where there could be destruction of the basal layer of the endometrium. It could be that is because of the infection, or the destruction of the basalis could also be surgical, like vigorous curettage, aggressive myomectomy, partial aberration during hysteroscopy, radiotherapy. It could also be because of prolonged assessing your patient must rule out whether the patient is under any treatment or any medication in this particular cycle that she may forget to tell you that she's on oral contraceptive pills. And she may be taking it for a while, and you may call her on day 15 to see a thin endometrium. So always be sure that it is a natural cycle without any medications for at least 1 to 2 cycles prior, to give you the best assessment of the endometrial thickness. Now, Mullerian anomalies, for example, septate, bicornuate, the part where the septum is, that wall has less perfusion, less endometrial thickness, and therefore implantation on these walls lead to poor pregnancies. Idiopathic. So idiopathic where we are not able to figure out a cause. And it could be intrinsic or we just have not been able to find out what it is. Now, in this study, they have done transfer of euploid blastocysts in many patients, and they have found that the pregnancy rate, even with a poorer endometrium, is acceptable, but the pregnancy rate in type 3, that means hyperechoic endometrium, is where which suggests a prematurely closed window of implantation, is low. So, but in all these patients, they have ruled out any other cause of poor endometrium. So the reason I'm trying to highlight this is that don't just write off all patients with poor endometrium. Of course, endometritis is a very bad reason for poor endometrium and sometimes not amenable to treatment, but the idiopathic ones may surprise you with good results. So what are the treatment options available to us? Hysteroscopy, treating infections. Professor Sharma is going to cover it very well. Just one second. Then improving endometrial perfusion, like for example, low-dose aspirin, pentoxifylline, sildenafil, and new modalities like granulocyte colony stimulating factor and PRP and stem cells. So let us touch upon all of these, and we will leave antitubercular treatment to Professor Sharma. I'm sorry. Right. So hysteroscopic adhesiolysis, so of course, it is not in the scope of today's discussion, but we all know that primary prevention, doing a gentle curettage, doing a gentle myomectomy, especially when you're doing a hysteroscopic myomectomy, not, shaving off the entire endometrium with the fibroid, just making a small nick, enucleating the fibroid. These small, small tips can go a long way in helping our patients. Then it has to be skilled hands. Myomectomy, not everybody should be allowed to do it. There should be a learning curve. Then, of course, it is use less current. There was a lot of debate whether putting in an inert material after hysteroscopy is helpful or not. But then today's, it has been the AOGL consensus in 2017 has clearly made it clear that putting an inert material, they have actually removed the copper from the copper T, or they've used the old Lippes loop, does improve the overall endometrium and prevents minor adhesion post-adhesiolysis. And of course, giving estrogen after your procedure. So inert material. Treating endometritis. Now, I think we've already got a question for that. And endometritis is infection of the endometrium. There could be symptoms and signs of endometrial discharge, mild fever, and plasma cells in the endometrial biopsy. When you put in a hysteroscope, it could be edematous, hyperemic, micropolyps. The treatment is, interestingly, there are very, very few studies for endometritis. And the treatment is usually doxycycline 100 milligram twice daily for about 2 weeks for both the partners. There have been studies of intrauterine antibiotics in which they have taken dilute ciprofloxacin and they have instilled about 1 cc every 3 days for about 10 sittings, and they have found good results. But these are case series and we do not have long-term studies. Unfortunately, in India, where we have a lot of endometritis, we still haven't been able to collate too much of data towards it. Genital tuberculosis, I'm going to leave the entire set of slides, and I'm sure, including myself, I'm waiting for Sir to touch tuberculosis. Now we've come to hormonal manipulation. So you have seen this patient with poor endometrium. Say you are planning an IUI and an IVF cycle. What all you have endometritis, or you have given treatment for endometritis, yet the endometrium is not up to your satisfaction. So what all treatments can you give to thicken the endometrium to improve the implantation? So estrogen, of course, estrogen, it can be oral estrogen, vaginal estrogen, transdermal estrogen, and a lot of study and a lot of drugs available in which the transdermal and the vaginal estrogen, they bypass the first pass effect of the liver, high local concentration. Their effectivity is equal or better than oral estrogen. However, there is no consensus whether one is better than the other as far as pregnancy rates are concerned. Now, oral estrogen, they undergo the first pass metabolism in the liver, and for some women, say obese, etc., they have increased risk of venous thromboembolism. Their bioavailability is slightly lower, and it can cause gastritis and nausea, but it is time-tested, long-standing. Estradiol, usually estradiol valerate is the one that is used as oral preparations. As far as estrogel, the gel applications, usually it is one actuation, you can apply it once. Again, it avoids the first pass metabolism, reduces the risk of venous thromboembolism. Side effects are, avoided. Oral gastrointestinal side effects are avoided. However, at least in India, it's more expensive than the oral preparation. And again, there has been estradiol hemihydrate and estradiol valerate in the market, and there's a lot of confusion as to which is better than the other. Again, large studies have been done which have not proven one to be better than the other. It does not suffice here to say that estradiol hemihydrate is a most physiological form, and it is rapidly available after ingestion, and it has diffuses through the cell membrane and binds to and subsequently activates the nuclear estrogen receptor. And valerate does undergo a very extensive, liver metabolism, and those with liver problems may not find valerate to be the best estrogen. However, both are equally effective as far as pregnancy rates are concerned. So how much dose can be given? Say you are doing a frozen embryo cycle, you've seen the patient on day 7, day 10, you've given estradiol valerate 2 milligrams 3 times daily, and the endometrial thickness is just say 5 mm on 8 days. So you could go up to 12 milligrams. You could give 2 tablets in the morning, 2 tablets in the afternoon, 2 tablets in the evening. I mean, that's almost the highest that we have gone to, but studies have given much higher doses of estrogen in prior cycles to prep the endometrium. So they've even gone up to 24 milligram, but not on the cycle of transfer. So I think 12 milligram is quite okay. And another thing that you need to know that you can give it long. It's not that on day 15, if you've not reached your endometrium, you need to stop and cancel and re-prepare. You can go longer till about 3.5 weeks. Accurate down regulation is important. We'll touch upon that in a little while. Now the other drugs, HCG. Now HCG is produced by the endometrial epithelial cells in the secretory phase, and it plays a paracrine role in regulating different cytokines and growth factors, and studies have shown that it does improve the endometrial thickness. It's given on day 8 of the cycle, 150 IU subcutaneous, till endometrium reaches at least 7 mm. Now, how do you give 150 IU of HCG? say you have a 5000 IU HCG vial, you dilute it with 5 ml, it becomes a 1:1 ratio. And from your insulin syringe, you can pick up to say 125 or 150. And there are certain drug companies that have given smaller HCG. They, of course, may be a little bit more expensive. GnRH analog. See, of course, we know we give GnRH analog in OHSS, but this is different. This is normoresponder or hyporesponder. You've given HCG injection. And along with HCG, you've also given triptorelin 0.1 or leuprolide acetate 0.1 on day of HCG. You've given it 3 days later and again 3 days later. So they're different regimens. So you can give it on day of HCG and on day 5, or you can repeat it twice. Again, there seems to be a paracrine action right in the endometrium to improve endometrial receptivity and therefore pregnancy. Again, in quite a nascent stage of study, not too many randomized studies done, but very, very promising. So these are hormones, estrogen, HCG, GnRH analog. Now there are drugs that improve perfusion into the endometrium, and one of them is our favorite low-dose aspirin. It reduces the inflammation by inhibiting cyclooxygenase. It improves the endometrial receptivity, and it also is known to reduce subendometrial contraction. Weitstein, as early as 1997, said that it is associated with higher implantation rate and clinical pregnancy rate, but it may not correlate with increased endometrial thickness. And similar study was given in 2000. However, after that, there have been a lot of randomized controlled trials and meta-analysis, but aspirin has not stood the test of time for increased endometrial thickness, but I cannot say not for improving implantation. Similarly, vitamin E is an antioxidant and vasodilator. Pentoxifylline has been tried in patients with vascular pathologies, in women who have undergone radiotherapy and have shrunken endometrium. These are drugs that have been tried to improve the endometrial perfusion. Sildenafil. Sildenafil, of course, is a vasodilator effect of nitric oxide. I'll again request all my participants to please keep your speakers on mute. It will help all of us. Thank you. It exerts its effect. So sildenafil it has nitric oxide, it vasodilates, it acts on the endometrial smooth muscle. And the famous study in 2000, 25 milligram vaginal sildenafil was given as a follicular phase, and it improved uterine artery blood flow and endometrial thickness. It was also given in patients with Ashman syndrome with successful cases. However, unlike like aspirin, sildenafil has not stood the test of time with prospective randomized controlled trial. It does not seem to improve endometrial thickness, but definitely pregnancy may be improved. L-arginine, nitroglycerine, again vasodilatory and inflammatory response. So these are all drugs: aspirin, sildenafil, nitric oxide, nitroglycerine, improving the endometrial flow. And what has been, stood kind of the test of time in limited studies is sildenafil. New modalities. We all know about CSF, PRP, and stem cells. So let us hear a little bit about them as to what they do and when can we use it. Granulocyte colony stimulating factor. It increases the endometrial stromal cell decellularization mediated through cyclic AMP, and it improves the proliferation and differentiation of the endometrium. It can be given subcutaneous as well as intrauterine. It is given on the 12th or 13th day of estradiol administration, on HCG day, and on pickup day. And its effects comes between 48 to 72 hours. The first study of GCSF was done in New York, where they gave it to about 4 patients with donor IVF who had very poor endometrium, and all 4 conceived. They gave it intrauterine. And they said that Gleicher et al. And they said that, well, GCSF seems to be very promising. But then there were a lot of, I've been told there is no audio. Can you hear?
I'm loud and clear. Yes.
All right, thank you.
Welcome.
So Gleicher et al. Gave granulocyte colony stimulating factor and the endometrium improved, but again, they did a lot of randomized controlled trials. Then implantation increased in a few, but strong studies have not yet been able to bring GCSF in a very big, strong way. But we found in few observational studies, we found that the endometrium was increasing in these patients with GCS in FET cycles, where we started administering subcutaneous GCSF. So we did a study. And what did we do? We took 107 patients. It was a 6-month retrospective study. And in group 1, we only gave GCSF. And in group 2, we gave sildenafil and low-dose aspirin. And it was given on the 10th, 12th day, and it was repeated after 72 hours. And in the other group, only sildenafil and aspirin. We performed embryo transfer in both groups when the endometrial thickness improved to more than 7.5 mm. In group 1, 4 cases were cancelled, where GCSF was given because they did not reach 7.5. And in group 2, 15 cases were cancelled. So of the cases that we did the embryo transfer, 59% conceived in group 1 and 27% in group 2, so which is highly statistically significant. So this is giving us a little bit of hope that perhaps this may be a molecule that helps in our patients with endometritis. This is, of course, a very small study, and it's a randomized control trial. The good thing is we're giving it subcutaneous. So all these things of bringing the patient, putting in a catheter, going intrauterine is all avoided. So it's a very simple way of, we presented in ISAR Hyderabad. It was the first study in India that showed the role of subcutaneous GCSF in thin endometrium. And personally, I feel it's hugely promising and we need to do more work on it. PRP. Now, PRP and stem cells. The ICMR guideline has said that stem cells cannot be used except in the realms of research. And you need to have a body to go through your ethical review and all that. So it is wrong to start giving stem cells when you are not doing it under the structure of a research study with thorough approval from the bodies like ICMR. However, PRP, if it is obtained in your center and your center itself manufactures the PRP without taking it outside, apparently there have been clearance that centers can use it. We did have a discussion with ICMR a few weeks ago, and they are yet to come out with clear guidelines. But so far as my understanding goes, PRP within the center without taking it outside is allowed. So what do? We collect about 15 ml blood from the peripheral vein, and then we centrifuge it for about 15 minutes at slightly high RPM, which is about 3000 RPM. And then we discard the supernatant, and then we take the supernatant, we centrifuge it again at 1000 RPM, and then whatever is remaining at the bottom, we dilute it with 1 ml, and then we infuse it into the endometrium. And this is done again on day 10 and HCG days. So it's done with a catheter like this, and you infuse it very slowly. You take about 1 ml of it, and you do it on the 10th day, and then you can do it again 72 hours later. And there have been encouraging studies as far as PRP is concerned. It's still experimental and can be considered the last ditch effort before you want to give up or tell adoption or surrogacy to this couple. Now, bone marrow stem cells, a good study has been done at All India Institute of Medical Science under Professor Neeta Singh, where they took the bone marrow and then they sent it to the stem cell lab in All India Institute itself. They took the mononuclear cells, it's a buffy coat, and they took about 3 ml of it and they delivered it through ovum pickup needle into the uterus, transmyometria. They delivered it at the fundus and the anterior and the posterior part. This was done with proper ethical clearance. And then these were women of Asherman. This was a pilot study, and 5 out of 6 started menstruation. So it was hugely promising. This was somewhere in 2015-16, if I remember rightly. Let me just see the year. Yeah, I think it was 16. And still now large studies are trying to find out how the stem cell is actually helping these infertile women. And I had a word with Professor Singh, and she was saying that it helps women where little bit of healthy bacillus is there. In women where the bacillus is completely shattered, putting in stem cells may not help in recreation of the endometrium. Now, in conclusion, let me touch upon ERA. Now, though ERA is not done just for thin endometrium, it is widely being studied and discussed in patients with IVF failures. And it seems to be one of the treatments where you try to transfer 1 day later or 1 day ahead and try to fit in the right implantation window for that particular patient. So your endometrium could be receptive or non-receptive. And if it is non-receptive, you again take a sample and again you send it, and then it tells you. But the question is, so the studies that have said that ERA helps, they're good studies, they're robust studies, but they are mostly by the group which is associated with, ERA testing manufacturing. There have been studies outside that group, and one of them, does the endometrial receptivity array really provide personalized embryo transfer? And in this, they said that it does not seem to improve the ongoing pregnancy rate, and further studies are needed to elucidate whether it helps in a subgroup of patients. Now, this Chinese study, incorporation variability in ERA, they've said that they concluded that independent groups should be able to perform studies on the ERA test. This study is based on a single patient. The lack of consistency within the period is intriguing. Hopefully, this report may lead more researchers without a direct financial benefit. So I'm trying to say that we need to understand these methodologies and be really sure whether this is going to lead to a better pregnancy rate to our patients. What do we do at our center with poor implantation, poor endometrial thickness? We rule out any cause. I think I've been muted.
We can hear you now.
Okay. So I'll finish in about 5 minutes. So we rule out any cause. So we do hysteroscopy. We do hysteroscopy in a non-medicated cycle in a patient with thin endometrium, and we take a biopsy. We rule out endometritis, and if everything else is ruled out or treated, we plan estradiol valerate maximum 12 milligram up to 3 weeks. If oral doesn't work, we can go to transdermal. If that doesn't work, we can go to letrozole and gonadotropin cycles. So you need to change protocol, and each patient may not benefit with the same protocol. Downreg cycle is preferred in adenomyosis and endometriosis for any embryo transfer or IVF or even IUI cycles. In adenomyosis and endometriosis, endometrial receptivity is definitely better if you're going ahead in a down-regulated cycle. So your frozen embryo cycle can happen in a natural cycle, can happen in a hormone replacement cycle, or can happen in a stimulated cycle. We prefer down-regulated hormone replacement cycle, but if that does not work, then we change. We go to plain hormone replacement, or we go to letrozole HMG, or we go to natural. And of course, we keep on adding adjuvants. The adjuvants that are routinely used are sildenafil, G-CSF, and aspirin. I have to admit that aspirin, despite its lack of efficacy in randomized controlled trial in meta-analysis, few studies have strongly advocated its implantation benefits. But lately, we are also trying GnRH analog, low-dose HCG, and PRP in a small subset of patients. Points to remember: ensure down regulation. Say you are doing a donor cycle, a frozen embryo cycle, or you're even doing a simple ovulation induction cycle. Please check that the endometrium is thin on day 3, day 4. There are no large follicles sitting on the side. So if you already start with a high E2 level, you will never get the pregnancy, whatever adjuvants you give or whatever treatment you do. So start with low E2 levels, and a quick scan is a good way to rule that out if you've not used down regulation. But if you've used down regulation like Lupron, etc., that's very good. Sometimes when you start estrogen on say day 3 or day 4, it may not be enough to down regulate the growing follicle from the previous cycle. So here you're giving E2, but a follicle is also growing, and you are just measuring the endometrial thickness and you're giving progesterone, etc., and you forgot to measure the follicle that is growing on the side, and so your entire hormonal axis will go haywire. So time it, let the follicle reach its size, give the HCG, and then do your transfer or IUI or whatever. So just measure the endometrial thickness in a frozen or a donor cycle. If the patient starts spotting or you see fluid in the endometrium on day 10, day 11, day 12, please cancel that cycle. She will not get pregnant in that cycle. And if you have a thin endometrium, she can still get pregnant, but ensure you've got good embryos and your transfer technique is perfect. Persistently thin endometrium, do not try more than 2 to 3 attempts, and stop treatment or adoption or surrogacy are options that we must offer to our patients. These specific questions we can take in our Q&A session. And the last point about this large meta-analysis on the various medications that help or do not help in thin endometrium. So, there has been this important study that comes on the web every time you type thin endometrium, and this was in Canada this year. So in that it has come that insufficient evidence for use of any adjuvants, right? Now in that, just because I use adjuvants, I'm not trying to say the weaknesses of the study, but I think we all need to be a little bit open to whatever literature we are studying, and I'm sure Sir will highlight a lot of our Indian studies. The Western studies, firstly, are not reflective of our population. Endometritis is completely not taken in that group of studies. There has been gross generalization. They've taken just one RCT of one drug and say it does not help. I think we need to have much more data to just discard drugs from our paraphernalia of treatment. There's no other study of other endometrial assessments, and of course, we need stronger studies. So I'd like to conclude here by saying thin endometrium is a strong marker of poor endometrial receptivity, but not always. We must rule out the treatable causes of thin endometrium. We need to follow stepwise estrogens, aspirin, sildenafil, GCSF. We can change protocol. What works for one cycle may not work for the other cycle, and what works for one patient may not work for the next patient. Newer options like vitamin E, pentoxifylline, HCG, GnRH analog, PRP must be explored, and stem cells should be done only in clinical trial setting. And as clinicians, we must know where to draw the line. Last but not the least, we need very larger studies for our database to know what helps our patients. Now, I'd like to hand over the next session to Sir, and we are all looking forward to hear what he has to say. So thank you so much. So Aparna, how do I get out of this? I'll stop sharing here.
Thank you so much, Kaveri Banerjee ma'am, for that in-depth presentation on thin endometrium where we are today. Over to you, Dr. J.P. Sharma, sir.
Sir is on mute.
Okay, just unmuted him.
Oh, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Good evening.
Okay. Yeah. Good evening. Thanks a lot, Dr. Kaveri, for this opportunity, as well as Dr. Aparna Savrup. So, Dr. Kaveri has made my work a lot easier. She has highlighted very well already the various aspects of thin endometrium, because in India, genital tuberculosis is a very, very important cause of thin endometrium. So whenever you see thin endometrium on ultrasound or otherwise, patient not conceiving, so genital tuberculosis should always come background, and we must rule out tuberculosis in such patients. That should be the message I want to convey. And now we start our. So we know that tuberculosis is a major global problem. Almost 2.2 billion people suffering from it. And in India, nearly 1.3 million people are affected by tuberculosis. We know that it is caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but rarely Mycobacterium bovis can also cause, especially if we take unpasteurized milk. And we know that genital tuberculosis almost always occurs secondary to pulmonary tuberculosis, or sometimes from abdominal or other types of tuberculosis. And the spread is usually either hematogenous or lymphatic route. And sometimes it can be contagious from the GIT tuberculosis. And the organs affected are fallopian tubes in 90 to 100% cases. This is very important from infertility point of view. That means in spite of treatment, most patients tend to have blocked tube. And this has an important bearing, because then they can go for IVF, as endometrium is involved in about 70% cases. So these 30% patients where endometrium is spared but tubes are involved, later on they will be very suitable for IVF and embryo transfer. Sometimes it can involve the ovaries in about 30% cases, cervix in about 5 to 10% cases, and vagina and vulva are very rare, 1%, and rarely it can cause even vulval tumor or vaginal cancer. It may mimic that. So there may not be any symptom. That's what I want to highlight. In case of latent tuberculosis, there may not be any symptom up to 11% patients, but there can be patients may have generalized symptom like fever, night sweats, loss of appetite, lost weight, poor general condition. But in the case of genital TB, you may not get actually any of these symptoms. So menstrual inspection, initially when there are basically ulcerative lesions, patients tend to have menorrhagia, or even like postmenopausal bleeding in elderly patient and abnormal uterine bleeding in young patients. But then later on, when endometrium is eaten up by the tuberculosis, then patient will tend to have hypomenorrhea, oligomenorrhea, and sometimes even amenorrhea. Rarely amenorrhea can also be due to antigonadotropic effect of tuberculosis, because tuberculous toxins, they are antigonadotropic in nature. And infertility is usually the presenting complaint in most of the patients, and it can be primary or secondary both. Patient rarely can present with mass abdomen, abdominal pain, chronic pelvic pain, and rarely acute abdomen and abdominal discharge. Similarly, there may not be any signs in genital tuberculosis, and patient may have fever, lymphadenopathy in case of lymph node tuberculosis, chest crepitation in case of past pulmonary TB, and abdominalization may be normal or maybe there may be mass abdomen which can be vague or definite. They can be ascites, they can be doughy feel of abdomen. And then on vaginal examination, they can be uterine enlargement, that is pyometra, adnexal masses, tuborian mass, fullness and tenderness in pouch of Douglas. And rarely they can be hypertrophic or ulcerative lesions in cervix, vagina, or vulva, and labial mass, or VVF and RVF can also be there. Diagnosis is, I mean, very, very important is that, suspicion in your mind. Like, I think all infertility doctors do have this suspicion in mind when they attend to Indian patients. Recently, there was a case report from New England Journal of Medicine. A patient presented to Boston Massachusetts General Hospital. Nobody thought her to have tuberculosis, and she was of Malaysian origin. So ultimately, she was turned out to be tuberculosis. So, I mean, it can also affect patients, especially who are migrating to other countries. So family history of tuberculosis is very important. I'm getting a lot of patients where the girls, when they were adolescent, they looked after their dying father or dying grandmother, grandfather, etc., who died of tuberculosis, because in Indian villages it's a routine that girls tend to look after their sort of ill parents or grandparents. So that may be the reason of their tuberculosis. And then there can be, so in the family history of tuberculosis or past history of TB in the patient or in the family. And sometimes this past history of TB in unmarried state may not be available. So we need to talk to the patient in confidence, because she may be hiding it from her husband. So that is very crucial that we, take a patient to one side and ask her that I'll not disclose it to your husband. So that history is very important. The general physical examination is important for any lymphadenopathy, any tuberculosis at any other site in the body, like joint, bone, skin. Quite often, I remember seeing one or two adolescent girls. They were admitted. They had tuborian masses, and I admitted them. I thought how to take biopsy from that or FNAC from that tuborian mass, and then I found that she was having a leaking lymph node in her neck. So from there we took a sample and it was tuberculosis. And when we started rated, that tuborian mass disappeared. Another patient had actually, she had a swollen ankle, and from there when we took sample, it was tuberculosis. So rather than taking a FNAC from tuborian mass in unmarried girls, we should look for other areas of tuberculosis, and then that can give us a clue. Similarly, we need to do abdominal examination, chest examination, abdominal examination on them. Genital examination, circular examination is important. Sometimes there can be cervical growth which mimics like cancer, but actually it is cervical tuberculosis. And then, of course, bimanual examination for tuborian masses is also important. And tests will depend on the site of TB and clinical presentation. So for the other tests, like they are not very very crucial, but they should be useful. Like we can do raised ESR, then anemia, leukocytosis, lymphocytosis can go in favor, but they are not very highly specific and diagnostic. X-ray test to confirm or exclude respiratory tuberculosis, because the patient may have past tuberculosis, and sometimes you can get enlarged lymph node on X-ray test. Mentox test has limited utility, but if it is more than 10 millimeter, can give some clue about tuberculosis. Serological tests are not they are banned now, we shouldn't be using them. But endometrial sampling, which you can do endometrial aspirate, curate, or biopsy, you can do with Carmen's cannula, you can do with PEL, you can do with any basically endometrial biopsy curate. And then this is very crucial, try to take in the premenstrual phase, day 21 to 26, and then we send the specimen, make sure that try avoid mixing of blood with the sample. So it's better if you take the white tissue and then we divide into two parts. So one part we send in saline, other part we put it in formalin solution, and the part in saline is sent for 4 tests. One is AFB microscopy, AFB culture, gene expert, and PCR. Other tests like LAMP, etc., they are not yet routinely available, but these 4 tests are mandatory for all patients. So AFB microscopy, AFB culture, gene expert, and PCR, and one part in formalin for histopath evidence of granuloma. So these are so you can do microbiome culture and smear, and you can do bacterial culture also, you can do MGIT culture also. So you have to basically coordinate with your microbiology team, and usually all infertility doctors, they tend to have one favorite microbiologist of them with which they are comfortable. So that helps actually to pick up more cases. I will strongly recommend that you have basically rapport with one good microbiologist and try to send samples to him or her, that the pick-up rate will be better than. So PCR test, though it's a very sensitive specific, it tends to have high false positivity rate. So in our experience, if you do PCR reaction, the test comes back positive. Large number of hello. So PCR test can be false positive in many cases. So can you please, somebody is speaking, so can you please keep your mobile on mute? No, otherwise interfering with the lecture. So PCR test is to be done. It's very useful test, but alone on the basis of PCR, we don't diagnose tuberculosis. So what we do is the patient has got AFB microscopy positive, AFB culture positive, gene expert positive, or histopath positive, then we take his tuberculosis. But if it's only PCR positive, then we don't diagnose tuberculosis only on that basis, but we subject these patients to laparoscopy or hysteroscopy, which is indicated anyway because of their infertility. So this is important. But if the patient otherwise has got gene expert positive AFB microscopy culture, then no need to do any more tests, and we can straight away start the treatment to them. And so this is gene expert is recommended by WHO, and this can be taken. It gives you rifampicin resistance also. So these are the bacilli which you can see on microscopy. Okay, and the gene expert study which we published in European journal, it is a useful test. And then laparoscopy is very useful. So if the patient has got the positive PCR, but other tests are negative, and then even for diagnosing tubal patency, we need to do laparoscopy. It's a very useful tool to diagnose FCTB, especially for tubal, ovarian, and peritoneal disease. Various laparoscopic finding can be tubercles on peritoneum and ovary, cages, nodule, tubo-ovarian mass, hydrosalpinx, pyosalpinx, tubal blockage, beaded tubes, tobacco pouch appearance, abdominal pelvic perihepatic adhesion, and cystitis. And it can sometimes masquerade like ovarian cancer. We have done studies, and so it's important. And many times we open the abdomen thinking it's to be a cancer and turns out to be tuberculosis. So in that case, don't make it as a prestige point that I have to do surgery. So just come out, take biopsies, and come out. Then this is another study which we published. Then we could find tubercles on peritoneum, tubo-ovarian masses, cages, nodules, and cystitis, hydrosalpinx, pyosalpinx, beaded tubes, tobacco pouch appearance, and inability to see tubes due to adhesion. So these are the various, like, you can see hydrosalpinx, congestive fallopian tube, tubercles. These are the other, you can see hydrosalpinx, cages, nodules in this case. And adhesions are very common in these patients, and they're vascular adhesions. So don't try to do adhesive because it will not serve much purpose and patient will bleed. And so this is the perihepatic adhesion. You can see again perihepatic adhesion, and you can't see the liver. Again, in this case, totally calcified tubes. In this case, prognosis for fertility is going to be very, very poor. Okay, again, cages nodule and this hydrosalpinx. Again, hydrosalpinx, and you can see the tubercles. Again, cages nodule. Okay, hydrosalpinx, frozen pelvis. And sometimes tuberculosis can be associated with endometriosis also in India because the two conditions are so common. Again, tuberculosis with endometriosis. This is, you can see the angry-looking uterus and fallopian tube, very hyperemic tubes. Okay, again, this you can see the cages nodule, hydrosalpinx. This is the finding which we see convoluted tubes can be there in FCTB. And in this case, you can see many tubercles, frozen pelvis, and almost shaggy area on the uterus, as if a white carpet has been laid on the uterus. Okay, and this is another sign which we had described, that's hanging gallbladder sign. In this case, the gallbladder, liver becomes adherent to the anti-abdominal wall because of perihepatic adhesion in tuberculosis, and then the gallbladder looks like a hanging gallbladder. And you can see in the lower picture cages nodule also. Again, hanging gallbladder sign, and cages nodule in the omentum. And now we demonstrated another sign, Sarmaj python sign. In this case, fallopian tube is distended like a blue python. And later on, the tube may become, so there is a slow, dye goes slowly basically, as compared to normal patient where dye flows quickly. In this case, it goes slowly. This is the kissing fallopian tube sign which we described. In this case, you can see the cages material came out from one tube and both tubes became fused to each other. And you can see the cages nodule along with this, also a proven case of genital tuberculosis. Again, in this case, there can be ascending colonic adhesions. Again, a new sign of abdominopelvic tuberculosis. And this is a case of basically frozen pelvis, cages nodule, and tubo-ovarian masses. So, and hysteroscopy, again, some more laparoscopic finding you can see, more laparoscopic findings of adhesions and pelvic adhesions and this thing. Okay, sometimes this is just two. So, and another sign we described, dried tree branch sign. So fallopian tube becomes calcified and look like dried tree branches. Okay, you can see on the laparoscopy, they look like calcified tubes, like trigraph sign is also there. And this is the parachute sign which we have described. In this case, ascending colon gets added to the anti-abdominal wall. And this has a bearing on the laparoscopy. It's usually on the right side, ascending colon. So if you put a second port on this side, straightway we can go into the ascending colon, we can enter the bowel. So we should avoid that. Similarly, in this case also, the parachute sign, in which gets the cages nodule also on the mesentery, basically. Again, same parachute sign. So this is the basically frozen pelvis and on histoscopy, they can be tubercle, they can be pale cavity, as already highlighted by Dr. Kaveri Banerjee. So on histoscopy, there will be very pale endometrium, because which is a sign of basically thin endometrium. So in India, thin endometrium, or pale endometrium is most commonly caused by tuberculosis, and later on it can form the adhesions also. These are grade 3B adhesions, so hardly any cavity is left. So this will be a very hopeless case for even for IVF ET later on, because the endometrium is so much small, and even if you cut the adhesions, the prognosis is not very good, unfortunately. So aim is to basically diagnose and treat these patients well in time. Again, very grade 4 adhesion, there is hardly any cavity left. This is typical pale cavity, so which Dr. Kaveri mentioned in her lecture. So in this case, if you do ultrasound, it will be very thin endometrium, and the cavity is very pale on histoscopy. Normally, cavity should be pink in color. Again, adhesions are there, grade 1 adhesions, and so we have actually done studies on, and we found that laparoscopy can pick up more cases, and there is doing laparoscopy tends to be more difficult in these patients, so it should be done by senior consultants preferably, and because there is a risk of injury to the bowel and other structures. Then laparoscopy, histoscopic surgery, and tuboplasty has limited role. But what we see that after giving, suppose you have diagnosed tuberculosis, at that time on laparoscopy, we shouldn't do any laparoscopic surgery or histoscopic surgery. We give 6 months course of anti-tubercular therapy, that is routine. So we give 2 months of rifampicin, isoniazid, ethambutol, paraginate. So 4 drugs are given for 2 months, and then 3 drugs are given for next 4 months. So total 6 months therapy, daily therapy is given. After the end of the therapy, then we can do another laparoscopy, histoscopy on them, and tuboplasty is usually avoided, but peritubal adhesion can be cut. So basically, if at the end, and then because this helps us to prognosticate the further prognosis for the patient, especially infertility patients. So after your patient has completed a course of ATT for 6 months, you can do a laparoscopy, histoscopy on them. It will help us in prognosticating the cases and further management. So this is the here again, so at the end of the 6 months, if you find the fallopian tubes open, endometrium cavity normal, then patient can try for normal conception. You can give her ovulation induction. If tubes are blocked and endometrium is fine, then she can go for IVF-ET. IVF-ET tends to have very good results in case of tuberculosis after treatment is given. If endometrium is also gone to grade 3 adhesion or more than that, which cannot be cut by histoscopic adhesiolysis, and tubes are blocked, then this patient can go for surrogacy because her ovaries are normal. But really, I have seen 1 to 2% patients of advanced abdominal tuberculosis. Their ovaries are also eaten by the tuberculosis. Then this patient goes for adoption. So at the end of the 6-month therapy, you can plan whether the patient goes for normal ovulation induction, she goes for IVF-ET, she goes for surrogacy, or she goes for basically donor adoption. So that is very important, and this is the treatment I have already said. So we need to give them rifampicin, isoniazid, ethambutol, paraginamide for 2 months, and then 3 drugs for next 4 months. And usually we can do that. Now government has made it mandatory that we need to basically on ICSA.com we can register these cases to the government of India, or other simple method is that you can refer the patients to dot center, government dot center, and even the private practitioner refer the patient there. So they will report it to the government, and then they will give free medicine to the patient also. Most patients tolerate ATT very safely, and we counsel them about the importance of taking ATT. Initially, there may be some problem. Liver function tests are no longer routinely done. Pyrodoxine no longer routinely present. If the patient has got loss of appetite or symptoms of hepatotoxicity, like because all these 3 drugs can cause, and ethambutol can cause optic neuritis, while isoniazid, rifampicin, paraginamide can cause hepatitis. In that case, we need to do LFT, and if they are grossly deranged, then we stop these 3 medicines and gradually we restart them. Usually, most patients will be able to tolerate them. In that case, you take the help of the tuberculosis expert to help you. Surgery is usually avoided, but I said at the end of the therapy, we can do a laparoscopy, hysteroscopy for prognosis of the disease. But sometimes, I mean, if the patient has got ovarian abscess and all, we may do a limited surgery in the form of drainage of that abscess. And by mistake, if you have opened the abdomen and it turns out to be tuberculosis, it's better not to do THPSO on them, because doing hysterectomy will be very difficult. There is a risk of injuring the gut, and patient may require actually colostomy, etc. So we should do that actually. Okay, so give full treatment to the patient, and then only. This is the patient which I opened actually thinking to be ovarian cancer, but turns out to be tuberculosis. You can see the cages material coming out and totally frozen abdomen and pelvis. So in this case, then we just took biopsy and came out, and we gave her ATT, and not make it as a prestige band open, because there is risk of injury to the power. So this I have already said that at the end of the therapy, IVF is a very good option for them. I don't do IVF and Dr. Kaveri, so I refer my patients to Dr. Kaveri Banerjee. But that is a useful thing basically. IVF, it is very useful, especially if their endometrium is normal. So the tubes are blocked, endometrium is normal. They are very brilliant cases for IVF ET. But otherwise, like if they have sort of even endometrium is gone, then they can try surrogacy or some kind of option. This is a simple flowchart algorithm which we have made. So any patient, this is my last slide. So any patient of suspected case of FGTB, we need to do premenstrual endometrial sampling for smear, culture, gene expert, PCR, and histopath. And we use the term composite reference standard these days. In composite reference standard, if any of the tests like AFB microscopy positive is a confirmed FGTB, and start ATT. So AFB microscopy positive, culture positive, gene expert positive, histopath positive, then definitely we start treatment. If only PCR positive and or patient has got ovarian mass on ultrasound, CT, MRI, or some ultrasound finding like Dr. Kaveri, Dr. Ashok Rana, they do a lot of good ultrasound machine. If you can get some straw colored fluid, thin endometrium, some other findings, then also you can start ATT to the patient. Or you do laparoscopy or hysteroscopy on them, and on lapro-hystro, we can have definite finding of tuberculosis like cages, nodules, beaded tubes or tubercles, or we can have probable finding of tuberculosis like perihepatic adhesion, peritubal adhesion, hydrosalpinx, pyosalpinx, straw colored fluid, and other adhesion. Then it's a probable TB. Then also we start ATT. But if patient has got all these tests negative, only PCR positive, but no tuberian mass, ultrasound normal, and laparoscopy, hystoscopy also normal, then see not tuberculosis, then we don't start ATT. So that is it basically. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
We will be taking all the question and answers now.
Sure.
Okay. So, Kaveri ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes. I think it was I know you'll start taking the question, but sir, that was a wonderful presentation as always. And
not as good as Kaveri's, no?
No, sir. And the last slide is so important. If you could please share it with everyone, maybe you could share it with Aparna, and Aparna can distribute it to all our listeners. I think it was very helpful. So before Aparna, you start with the questions. Sir, we had this discussion a few weeks ago. Say we are doing IVF or IUI, and the patient has had thin endometrium. She is infertile. She does not have any other signs like laparoscopic or hysteroscopic caseous calcification or anything. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about PCR, which you've also mentioned. So in this patient, not conceiving, implantation failure, no other factors apart from thin endometrium and infertility, what is the scope of ATT and how, what will you recommend, and PCR testing, etc.?
Yeah. No, in this patient, I said PCR positivity with any other finding on either on ultrasound or on laparoscopy or hysteroscopy. So if you had done ultrasound and good ultrasound, like you yourself have done it, or some someone who is good in that case, then you have two findings. So patient is already infertile, patient has got positive PCR, patient has got thin endometrium. So then it is a probable tuberculosis. You need to treat it for 6 months, and then your chance of IVF ET also will improve, and even spontaneous conception with ovulation induction will also improve. So I'll treat such a patient. If the thin endometrium, it is strong evidence of goes in favor of tuberculosis in India. Thin endometrium cavity with
whom do we have to inform when we start the ATT? And what is the follow-up of such patients when they come back after 6 months? Is there a repeat test? If it comes positive again, do we test it again? These are common questions that many of us, including our patients, have.
Yeah, I mean, basically, we did a research project with the Government of India, Ministry of Health. In that case, we repeated laparoscopy, histoscopy, and endometrial sampling in all the patients after 6 months therapy. After when one group we gave 6 months, one group we gave 9 months, and we proved that 6 months therapy was as good as 9 months. So I mean that is proven now. We published it at RCT in European Journal of Scanning published. So 6 months, but and we repeated the same test again because we had committed to the government. So we found that this gene PCR can remain positive forever. So presence of positive, if you have, she had positive PCR and other finding of tuberculosis, and when we repeated laparoscopy, histoscopy in them, usually in all the patient on laparoscopy, histoscopy, almost, bearing 2 or 3 patients, in all other 98 to 99% patients, we found disappearance of the active TB lesions, but adhesions persisted. So if you see, you do histoscopy on them, laparoscopy, adhesions will persist, perihepatic adhesion will persist, but they are not active TB. Similarly, on histoscopy, they may still have little bit of pale cavity, but adhesion grade 3 to 4 will persist. But tubercle will disappear and flimsy adhesion will disappear. So this is the problem. So that doesn't mean the patient has got active tuberculosis now. And if you repeat PCR, the AFB microscopy culture, etc., will be negative. Granuloma will be negative, but PCR may remain positive for whole life. So that is not an indication of restarting the treatment. Once you again fine, so again positive PCR can stay there. So it's not this thing. So that is what is important.
Who should be informed? Who should be informed when we start antitubercular
Yes,
treatment?
the government has made it mandatory now. There is this site www.niksha.com. Niksha is a Hindi word of that. On that you can register your name. In fact, you will be given some money also by the government, and patient will also be given some token, 500 rupees a month for diet, etc. Otherwise, if you want to avoid that, what you can do, you can refer these patients to DOT center. So even from the private setup, you can refer the patient to DOT center. They can get free treatment there, and then they will be reported by them. Like all my patients are reported by our DOT center people. But otherwise, you can register yourselves also. www.niksha.com site. We make basically the dots. There will be a dot center near your area. So those medical dots officer there, make them your friends. They're very good. They want to cooperate with the private doctors also. Don't think that, don't compartmentalize doctors into government doctors separately. Government of India is very keen to take into actually private practice. So because then only we can control this menace. So we should be working together actually.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Aparna, we are open to take the questions now.
Yes, ma'am. So do you want me to start from the questions that were asked to you, or shall I begin with the questions that were asked to Dr. JB, sir?
We can take one each.
Okay. So, ma'am, this question is to you. Dr. Shubhadeep asked, are there any guidelines on treatment of acute or chronic endometriosis? Apart from empiric doxycycline, what can be used?
So yeah, again, that's a very important question. So far, the guidelines have only come for PID treatment. They have not come for just pure thin endometrium with features of endometritis. So what we do at our center is, once we have ruled out tuberculosis and we do see features suggestive of endometritis, we give doxycycline to both the partners for 2 weeks. In certain cases, things do not improve, and we also give them IV antibiotics, say ornidazole or fluoxetine combination, for about 7 days to 10 days. There have been patients who've had reactions to such medications, and we third generation cephalosporins. But yes, thin endometrium and endometritis, apart from tuberculosis, there are no fixed protocols yet.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So the next question is to sir. Dr. Vishakha has asked, explain the logic of low dose HCG and how many days to be given.
This is again, I think, to me, HCG.
Yes, I think it's clear, yes.
HCG is a molecule, as we all know, it leads to the final ovulation and the corpus luteum formation, and it also leads to the progesteronic changes of the endometrium. But it has also formed in very low doses to have a paracrine action inside the uterus itself with the release of VEGF molecules and leading to endometrium proliferation. It is given in very, very low doses, 150 units daily from day 6 to day 7 till the endometrium reaches about 7 to 7.5 mm. As I've mentioned earlier, you could take 5,000 unit of HCG, dilute it with 5 ml of water in a 1:1 dilution, and use the insulin syringe for daily administration. It is of course in the initial stage, and only case series have been documented. No large studies have been done on low dose HCG and thin endometrium.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So the next question is to Sir. Dr. Vandana is asking, what is the difference between TB and PID adhesions?
Okay. Yeah. Basically, tuberculosis and PID adhesions tend to be because of chlamydia, mycoplasma, gonorrhea, and all. So those adhesions tend to be more flimsy. You can break them more easily. While the tuberculosis and endometriosis adhesions and malignancy adhesions tend to be more firm, more vascular, more thick. And you don't gain, actually, there is a tendency, and we have this temptation, okay, when I have done laparoscopy, I have done laparotomy, let me cut these adhesions. But my experience is that don't try to cut those adhesions because you won't gain anything. The adhesions will be reformed and they are more vascular, and sometimes just the bowel is just behind these adhesions. So, I mean, it's better to come out and don't try to cut those adhesions because you won't gain much. The disease tend to be compartmentalized in those areas, so you won't gain much. They're different. They're more vascular, more thick, and more damaging, basically. And the thick adhesion may even persist after course of antituberous therapy. It doesn't improve the prognosis, and usually they may not cause much pain to the patient. So cutting them will not serve much purpose.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Vandana is asking another question. Right after that question is, what is the effect of TB on ovary?
Yeah, TB on ovary. I told that ovary is third most favorite site of tuberculosis to be affected. Like fallopian tubes in 90 to 100% cases, uterus in 70% cases, but ovaries are affected in about 25 to 30% cases. I mean, maybe 15% more severe cases. So, but we have seen, in my experience of seeing more than 400 or 500 patients of tuberculosis, in 2 or 3 cases, I have seen the disappearing ovaries. Dr. Kaveri, ovary just disappeared. But the TB bacteria ate away the ovaries. So these are the patients where you need to go for, the surrogacy will also fail in them. And so, or we have seen the patients, I mean, Dr. Neena Malhotra also did studies with me. So we did study that ovarian failure can occur in them. So even if ovaries are, either ovary can disappear altogether, totally eaten up by the mycobacterium, or ovaries become very small, or they become, I mean, hypofunctional basically. So their ovarian reserve gets reduced. I mean, Kaveri, I think, knows more than me in season IVF circuit. So their O are not that good as O of normal person. And Dr. B.N. Chakraborty has done a lot of work from Kolkata, and they have found that tuberculosis, latent tuberculosis, is an important cause of recurrent implantation failure. So endometrium as well as fallopian tube, their ovaries are also there. O are not that good quality as compared to others. I think Kaveri will agree with that.
Does giving anti-tubercular treatment to women with tuberculosis and ovarian failure, will that help in reducing their FSH level and retrieving some remaining follicles?
It depends, I mean, which stage you started. If the ovary has already been eaten away and almost gone completely, I've seen patients of total ovarian failure because of that. In that case, probably it's too advanced, then it may not help. But still, we must treat the patient. That's what I tell my patient, that I'm not treating only for infertility, I'm treating your tuberculosis because tuberculosis can kill you. Okay, so at the end of the therapy, after 6 months, I do another laparoscopy, cystoscopy on them, and we do ovarian functions, basically ovarian reserve and FSH and all. Usually it improves. In early stages, the improvement is dramatic actually. But if it is very advanced, totally eaten up by this thing, then patient will remain. If she has gone into failure, ovarian failure, then chances of basically permanency are more actually. Unlikely that it will improve. But still we have to give it at the end of the therapy. Then I call the patient, her husband and all. I talk to them, they cry, and all. But in the end, then I tell them, don't waste, don't sell your house and go for IVF because it won't work better if you just adopt the baby and all, So usually then they cry, but in the end, at least, then I feel satisfied, they feel satisfied that at least we have a right diagnosis, right? 20 to 30% patients, they improve dramatically, and then you can do IVF PT on them, but only say 20 to 30% patients are hopeless cases where it's too advanced.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, sir. The next question, ma'am, is for you. Dr. G. Usha, she's asking, can you repeat the dosage of GnRHA and low dose HCG used for thin endometrium?
So yeah, the HCG is given from about 7 to 8 days till it reaches about 7.5 mm. And GnRHA and analogs are given on day of HCG and about 5 days later. So again, GnRH analog is given in a small dose and it has very minute paracrine action on the endometrium cells, and it leads to endometrium proliferation. So GnRHA in thin endometrium works different from GnRHA to prevent ovarian hyperstimulation.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Hereafter, the doctors have not mentioned who they are asking the question to, so I'm just going to read out the question one by one, and I think you or sir, whoever can answer. So the next question is by Dr. Anupama. She's asking, can we start estrogen along with ATT after 3 or 4 months ATT for FET?
I think this question will be answered more by Kaveri, but I want to highlight here, whenever I'm starting patients of tuberculosis on ATT, so at that time we suspend their treatment. I mean, we shouldn't be doing active treatment on them. I think Kaveri will agree with me. So we don't do any IVF, we don't do any IUI on them. But at the same time, because all 4 drugs, rifampicin, isoniazid, ethambutol, pyrazinamide, all 4 drugs are totally safe even if they conceive. So they don't have to use condom. Many of my patients after 2nd or 3rd month, we don't treat them for infertility, but in case they have spontaneous pregnancy, quite a few of my patients have, fallen pregnant while during ATT, so that's fine. But in that case, don't stop the ATT because tuberculosis can cause early miscarriages. Also, it can cause implantation failure. It can cause miscarriage. It can cause IUD, missed abortion, IUD, preterm deliveries, and all these complications are more in them. So they should still complete all the 4 drugs, this thing. But IVF ET should wait till after the treatment of 6 months. That is what it means.
Yeah, agree with that, sir. Like for example, as you'd mentioned that none of these drugs are toxic. They're not embryotoxic. So natural conception is allowed. So therefore, in my subset of patients with good ovarian reserve, and in those patients who have agreed for donor egg IVF or have frozen embryos with us, where time is not a constraint, then definitely I prefer completing the course of ATT. As you've already mentioned that risks of miscarriage, etc. may be high. But those borderline subset of patients who do not want to go to donor egg, who have borderline AMH, and maybe trying naturally may not yield the pregnancy. After 2 to 3 months of initiating treatment, I do start ART treatment as well. And on the question of giving estrogens, which could be hepatotoxic as well as antitubercular, which may be hepatotoxic, can be started at the same time, but the liver function tests have to be monitored strictly, and we should not go to high dose estrogen.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So the next question is from Dr. Vandana, and I think Dr. JB Sharma already answered the question. She's asking, after how many months of ATT, when can we start stimulation?
After completion of the course. 6 months course of ATT. I mean, these days only 6 months course is given. So 2 months is intensive phase in which we give 4 drugs: rifampicin, isoniazid, ethambutol, paraginamide. Then we give 3 drugs. I mean, isoniazid, rifampicin, and ethambutol, paraginamide is stopped. So, but at least preferably for 6 months. But if you have to compromise, maybe in the intensive phase we should not do anything else. I mean, in the continuation phase, I mean, after 2 months you can still try as Kaveri is done. So I think you can keep a balance in between. After 2 months, I mean, on continuation phase you can still try.
Thank you. Ma'am, the next question is to you. It is from Dr. S. Jamal. What is the role of endometrial scratch?
So again, you know, this is those endometrial scratching. This study was done in All India Institute itself, and they did scratching. This is our Indian study, right? They did the study in IUI patients, and they did scratching before IUI, and they showed better pregnancy rates after endometrial scratching. But again, in the West, there were some studies coming up saying that scratching is beneficial. But Lancet last year came out with a study of, I think, 1,000 patients saying that it makes not much difference. So I personally, my experience with scratching has been, though they have been retrospective case series, we have not randomized them into patients with in whom we not randomize them for patients in whom we've done scratching and we've not done scratching. My personal experience in failed IVF cycles of endometrial scratching is, you know, it's on the positive side. We're getting better pregnancies. But if you look at international studies, the scratching has been shown to be not beneficial in the Lancet studies. But all Indian small studies have shown that it is beneficial. I think before we give up on it completely based on a Western study, we must perform larger studies to say that scratching is not useful. Personally, I feel it helps in recurrent implantation failure.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is addressed to Sir. Dr. Sunita Arora is asking, Sir, can there be any legal issues if patient started on ATT when only PCR positive with thin endometrium?
No, actually, there won't be a legal issue because even empirical ATT has been allowed. Okay, so but to be on the safe side, what I do, like what we do, many times we don't get the positive TB finding, but we have this gut feeling that this patient has got tuberculosis, like PC has got thin endometrium and all. So what I do, like, you know, of course I do laparoscopy many times. That findings are not typical, but I write case laparoscopy finding of tuberculosis seen. Okay, so that makes us safe. I mean, PCR positive with laparoscopic finding of tuberculosis, histoscopic finding of tuberculosis, or you can say like you do your own ultrasound scan. I mean, do PCR, then you do your own ultrasound scan. On that ultrasound scan, you write like, you know, finding that thin endometrium suggestive of tuberculosis. You know, hypo, like even we have done studies, I mean, in which the blood flow, endometrial blood flow is reduced in this. So there are, I mean, findings of tuberculosis in the form of reduced blood flow to endometrium, thin endometrium, some stalk alert, some fluid basically in the, you know, pouch of Douglas. So I mean, ultrasound finding of genital tuberculosis plus positive PCR. So you justify that and then you can give it. But I don't think there will be any legal issue usually. But if some patient wants to sue, that they can sue anybody for that matter. But ultimately, I think court will be with us. I mean, like that, you can't do defensive medicine. But definitely, I mean, only on the basis of PCR. Normally, like we don't start the treatment. We want PCR positive to something else. But justify it. I mean, like what I said, like, you know, either you do a laparoscopy or cystoscopy. On that, even if you don't see the typical finding and you feel that it is a case of tuberculosis, you can write that, you know, stalk alert fluid seen, some peritubular adhesion seen, tube were convoluted, tubes were, you know, a bit hyperemic and all, which may not be typical of tuberculosis, but, you know, positive PCR infertility patient, 2 findings are already there. Infertility, positive PCR. Why is he not conceiving them? No, and third finding, if you have any finding, hyperemic tube, which may not be specific for tuberculosis, the same thing you can see, which I showed you a lot of pictures. Some of them may not be actually tuberculosis. They may be, maybe even chlamydia, mycoplasma and all, but patient infertility, patient with positive PCR, those findings, then I gave them ATT. This is, but I mean, if somebody wants to sue, then nobody can stop, even if you any test you do, even if you do laparoscopy, they can do, but usually the code should be with the doctors.
Okay, thank you so much for that amazing explanation. The next question is to ma'am. It is again from Dr. S. Jamal. They want to know what is the role of COC in down regulation.
Combined oral contraceptive pill has been used for since ages for down regulation. It is a cheap drug. It is a good drug, but lately, request lately it has been shown that combined oral contraceptive pills, especially when it is given to say donors for long, to batch a cycle, then they have seen that the follicular response has been good, but the total number of M2s that have been got is less. And that the rationale that has been there is that with COC prolonged down regulation, there is so much of suppression of LH that your total M2 formation is less. So slowly COC downreg is being weaned off. Especially in poor responders, we do not give COC downregulation. We give luteal phase estrogen downreg to recruit maximum number of follicles. And even for our donors, we have stopped giving oral contraceptive pills. We are either giving estrogen or we are giving norethistron. The COC was given a long time for polycystic ovaries to reduce the LH level. Again, with recent Rotterdam, etc. criteria, FSH-LH ratio has been abandoned. So to be honest, at least, and also prolonged COC is associated with thin endometrium in 1 to 2 subsequent cycles. So I have almost given up on COC down regulating medication.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. The next question is by Dr. Tulika Sethi. She's asking, should we repeat endometrial biopsy to rule out TB after ATT before starting infertility treatment?
Yeah, this question has been answered. Yes, we should. We should do actually. I mean, I tend to do laparoscopy, histoscopy, and endometrial biopsy on all the patients after completion of the 6 months therapy, because that will tell you. Even I mean, Dr. Kaveri will agree. There is some other question I was seeing on it also coming. You need to do a histoscopy, laparoscopy, and endometrial sampling on them, because sometimes it can be a case of MDR TB. We have reported 6 cases of MDR TB first time from the world. So it can be MDR TB which will not respond to drug sensitivity. This thing. So number 2, but usually in my experience, in almost 99.9% patients, active TB will disappear, but PCR may remain positive. So I mean, PCR persistence, PCR positive doesn't mean patient has got TB, but active TB lesions always disappear. Sometimes the patient may have adhesion will be there, TO mass can be there, but it will be non-tubercular. I mean, it will be just this thing. Rarely the case can be of MDR TB. So you need to do, but that will help you in prognostication of the disease. Like if the TB is still persisting, it can be a case of MDR. So we need to do FNAC or you need to do PET-CT on these patients, selected patients, and then they may require actually category 4 treatment in the form of MDR. It is rare but possible. And secondly, I think Kaveri can answer better than me that at the end of the therapy, I also told you prognosticate it. I mean, you do endometrial biopsy, you do histoscopy, you do laparoscopy. On histoscopic, endometrium is fine. On tubes are patent, then the patient can try normal conception or ovulation induction. If tubes are blocked but endometrium is normal or grade 1 to maximum grade 2B adhesion, which can be cut with histoscopy, then you can try IVF in them. If endometrium is totally Esserman syndrome grade 4, which can't be cut by this, then this patient goes for surrogacy or more than that, like that. So repeat laparoscopy and endometrial biopsy is absolutely mandatory for prognostication of the disease and for further planning of management. Otherwise, also I think routinely also you are doing before doing IVF, you are doing histoscopy mock test in them anyway. So it will be act like a mock test also for them. Plus any active TB can also be ruled out, and you will see that in spite of ATT, the endometrium remains thin, but maybe thicker than before. But as compared to normal non-TB patient, it still remains thinner. And the endometrial blood flow, we did a study. Endometrial blood flow improves after ATT. Okay, but the improvement, in spite of improvement, it will not come back to a normal non-TB patient. I think Kaveri knows more than me in that matter. But yes.
I completely agree. And while we are starting anti-tubercular treatment, there are those findings, histopathological diagnosis, gene expert positive, forming of caseation. I mean, in these cases, there is no doubt we can start anti-tubercular treatment. The question comes when these solid findings are not there, but our suspicion is high. So, like one of our August delegates, Dr. Kishori, has mentioned that PCR is not encouraged or should be stopped according to Government of India guidelines. So, what do you have to say on this? I mean, as far as my understanding is there, infertility, any other finding, and PCR positive, and patient is not getting pregnant, I am justified in starting anti-tubercular treatment. So there's a lot of confusion on this. So we would need clarity from you on this. You've already explained.
I mean, I was part of those guidelines actually. Though they in the guideline they did not write PCR as one of the tests. So government actually does not want PCR to be part of it. But I mean, as a clinician and all, actually we end up in doing PCR because then what will happen if you depend on definitive tests like AFB microscopy, AFB culture, histopath, and gene expert, you will be picking up only maximum 35% cases. You will be missing 65 to 70% cases. And then, so either you do lepro-histo on them, on that basis you can do. So PCR, but I agree with Dr. Rajurkar, I mean, totally, he's a good friend of mine, that certainly when only on the basis of PCR positivity, we shouldn't start. In fact, we did a study, we blinded our microbiologist and I sent endometrial sampling of patients undergoing ligation from him. Out of 100 patients without her knowing. Can you believe it? 55% patient who are having ligation in India, nobody has ligation without 3 children or, at least. So 55% of them were PCR positive and no evidence of TB. So it can be very, I totally agree with Kishore Rajulkar that way, like that this thing, but certainly in case of infertility setup, I think you can't do without PCR because other tests are, the pickup rate is very low. Unless we have very sensitive and specific tests available to us, then only we can do. And for that matter, even gene expert is a type of PCR, no? So it's a higher group of PCR. So, but definitely I agree with him that many times the non-accredited PCR, we are not done by good labs and all. They tend to be false, very highly false positive. So you develop a rapport with a good this thing. And yeah, that's what Rajukar is saying. PCR is false positive. I totally agree with him. So if PCR is positive, you need to do some more tests on them, either ultrasound finding, ultrasound CT, PET, MRI, or laparoscopy, histoscopy. I mean, I tend to do on all positive PCR, I do laparoscopy, histoscopy in them because that is anyway required for them because of the infertility. And then if there are finding on positive finding, probable finding, even then I start them immediately.
Sure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Dr. Suranjit Datta. I just wanted to check with both of you. We have time, right, still to answer questions because we have a lot of questions pouring.
5 minutes or so, maybe.
About 5 minutes.
Oh, Anupma is there. My friend Anupma. She did a study, I mean, repeat histoscopy, and she found very high incidence of endometrial adhesion in spite of ATT.
Okay. Wonderful.
I suggest we will take the next 2 questions. And if you have any questions, doctors, please put in your questions along with your email IDs. And I will get the answers from both the panelists today and I will have them emailed to you.
And Dr. Kishore is writing a lot of things. No, my regards to Dr. Kishore. He's a great friend of mine and he's an authority himself. And Dr. Anupma Bahadur, they are good friends. In fact, I thank all the viewers who have come and spent the time with us. And with the very end of course. Yeah.
Okay. So the next question is from Dr. Suranjit Datta. They're asking diagnosis of subclinical genital tuberculosis and need to prevent complications of TB infections.
Okay. Yeah, this is actually, there is this concept of latent tuberculosis, which is very popular in USA, but not in India. I mean, that concept is coming. So basically, this is, in fact, this PCR positivity, which government does not agree, is probably latent TB only. if you ask Dr. Sonia Malik, she is strongly believer, and Dr. Jindal and all. So probably these patients are of latent tuberculosis. I mean, problem is that if you depend on the patient, the type of slide I showed, totally calcified tube, frozen pelvis and all, in that case, none of the treatment will be successful. Dr. Kaveri will also not be happy to take those cases. I mean, they are very hopeless cases even for IVF, PT, etc. So aim is that if you can develop markers, maybe tomorrow we can develop biochemical marker or something by which we can detect the tuberculosis in early stage or in latent tuberculosis stage, and then probably, I mean, the government of India is coming in pediatric age group. My wife is a part of that. I was asking them. So probably newer drugs are coming up, like isoniazid with rifampicin or something. No, so they are giving them only for 2 to 3 months. So probably for those latent tuberculosis, if we give those drugs not 6 months full course, then the results can be good and we can prevent development of full-fledged tuberculosis in them. But that concept is still, we don't actually know, enough studies are not there. In fact, most of the study done on tuberculosis have been from us, from India. And I keep getting actually letters, emails from USA, from Europe, from China. They have queries. And I told you recently that this patient of tuberculosis was missed by all doctors in Boston, Massachusetts General Hospital also, because they don't do endometrial biopsy routinely. And ultimately they did on this lady, and it turned out to be, it was actually epithelioid granuloma. So they were shocked to see epithelioid granuloma, so which can't be wrong also. This is important. So we should have very high suspicion, index of suspicion, and family history, past history is very, very important in these patients. And definitely, and sometimes, like as far as menstrual blood is concerned, normally menstrual blood has very low pickup rate, but you can do in unmarried girls. I had this one daughter of brigadier of a military. She was 34 years, unmarried, and I TO-mass and all, and it was not fitting into germ cell tumor and all. So in that case, I did endometrial. Unmarried girls, we don't do endometrial biopsy, so we did menstrual blood also. So pickup rate of menstrual blood is low. In that case, I mean, she had TO-mass, which was not specific of any other disease. I had strong suspicion of tuberculosis. Then this menstrual blood was positive for PCR, but not microscopic culture. So in that case, as a special case, because she had ultrasound finding, she had hypomenorrhea, and she had this positive menstrual blood PCR. So then I gave her ATT, and I wrote it actually. So, but in case of married women, you shouldn't be doing menstrual blood. It's not very, pickup rate is very poor.
So here I agree with you. One of our very difficult cases, she's had recurrent failures elsewhere, and then her main problem was thin endometrium. She had already taken antitubercular treatment. We had one failed cycle also with us, and then we used the plain estrogen transdermal protocol. We used GCSF, we used sildenafil. And so this is our, the lowest record of endometrium at about 5.7 millimeters of endometrial thickness. We got her pregnant. So even to our, I was very, very.
No, it's very rewarding. I mean, if on time you start ATT, then it's very, very, very much rewarding. In fact, when I was writing my chapter, for John Sturd, the girl who used to type, one day she was just looking at me. I said, why are you sad? She said, sir, I want to discuss with you. I have got genital tuberculosis, and what from your chapter I can make out, I will never conceive. I said, no, is it only PCR positive? She said, yes. I said, don't worry, you will conceive. And even before my chapter could be completed, it took time. She fell pregnant and she left the job and left my chapter in limbo. Ultimately got it, and she had a baby boy now. She left that job also. So I mean, only on positive PCR or latent tuberculosis, the results are very, very good actually. So
Okay, thank you. We will just take the last question for the day, and it is from Dr. Saptar, and she's asking, in blastocyst transfer also, do we give GCSF on high and after 72 hours or later?
Say that again? Sorry, I missed it.
In blastocyst transfer also, do we give GCSF on high and after 72 hours or later?
So GCSF is given before embryo transfer. It is usually not given after embryo transfer. So whether you do a cleavage cell or a blastocyst, you start from about 9th or 10th day earliest, and you can repeat it every 72 hours. maximum for about 3 doses till your endometrium reaches the desired, which in our case is minimum 7 millimeters, and then we start the progesterone. We do not give it after embryo transfer.
Okay, thank you so much for that, ma'am. It was a wonderful session, Dr. J.V. Sharma sir, Dr. Kaveri Banerjee ma'am. My National Sales Manager, Mr. Sunil Gupta, would like to say a note of thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very warm evening, Dr. Kaveri Banerjee, Dr. J.V. Sharma, and all the guests. On behalf of Sanjay and all the participants, I would like to extend the vote of thanks to Dr. Kaveri Banerjee and Dr. J.V. Sharma for such a wonderful and I would say most informative presentation we had for last so many days. Thank you, madam. Thank you, sir. Also, I would like to thank all the participants for being part of this webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I would also again like to thank the organization, Aparna, and last but not the least, sir, for taking out his precious time and experience, and all our listeners who have been with us till the end. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.